This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. So here's the big picture question. What's your problem? Because if you're going to solve your toughest problems, often the trick, the secret, change the problems that you solve. Sounds simple. Sounds easy. We all screw it up big time. My guest today, Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg, digs into this very issue. In fact, What's Your Problem is the title of his new book. Think about it. Are you solving the right problems? Am I solving the right problems? Do you work hard on something to find out? You focused on the wrong problem entirely? Do you spend your time on low impact work? Yeah, we all mess up. We all do this. We all do it probably way too much. I always enjoy one of these conversations that makes me think, that wakes me up, that smacks me upside the head and forces me to look at my life, my business, etc. in a new way. It's a matter of framing, reframing, and taking action to move forward. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg. There's a little bit of a problem that I see right now in the world. I wonder if we are framing this problem correctly. And the problem is something called coronavirus. I'm not even sure what the problem is exactly, which might be a great place to start and to let you to dive in. Look, we can use this hour to kind of pick this apart and use a lot of your research and your work and your understandings to try and get people to see this differently. But your work, your book made me think about this issue. I'm like, gosh, what is the problem exactly? It seems like there's a lot of problems.
You can see how this is portrayed in wildly different ways in the media. I'm not an expert in viruses, but very clearly, you can see some people just positioning around, they're framing it, oh, this is just like the influenza. What are you worried about? There are other people who are going in the completely opposite direction, preparing for the apocalypse. You can see even how people's own agendas start to sneak into this around scapegoating. Oh, who's to blame for this? What's going on? Why is the stock market suddenly acting up in various ways? It's just this phenomenon that comes in, and you can immediately see how people start framing it like anything else in our lives. We start framing it, we start comparing it to other things in order to start getting a handle on how to do it.
The way that you just started to frame the situation, the problem, I agree. Those are the kind of basic ways that people might do it. I think the way that I first want to do it is I first want to know, well, what's the data?
Yeah, even the data, you can start to see people spinning that in different ways. Oh, this is 10 times more lethal than influenza is. This is a big reason to worry. Other people are going to say, well, there's not that many people who's been infected yet compared to the total population. How big is this really? Even when you see then higher infection numbers in some countries, you immediately start seeing people framing that around the differences. Okay, but this is in Italy where they don't have this or that. Things will be different here in the US or in Asia, different parts of Asia that hasn't reached yet or whatever.
If you and I were to sit down and say, what is the problem? One problem is people are getting sick and a certain number of them are dying. We don't have a vaccination. How else would you start to look at something like this?
Another way to frame it would be around the uncertainty, because what you just described, people getting sick and dying, that's something we see every day. There are lots of different diseases that kill people. This one is different because we don't know too much about it. There's great uncertainty around it, which arguably is one of the things that's affecting stock market so much. As you know, there's nothing worse than kind of not knowing what's going on overall. It makes everybody hesitate. Everybody loves a stable situation in general. Here, because we don't know, oh, will there be travel lockdowns or something? People just start pausing all types of activities. Maybe apart from kind of stocking up on supplies, I'm pretty sure that the makers of masks are seeing pretty glorious days at the moment. You can see here that's one way of framing it. I thought of a really interesting, more high-level way of thinking about this, which is our general level of preparedness for this type of situation. So some years ago, I read a book by David Quammen called Spillover. That very accurately describes what we're seeing at the moment. He's an expert in diseases that jump from animals to human beings. He warns about a situation like this happening. In some sense, we might go in and say, well, part of the problem here is we haven't had a real preparedness for this type of situation. A silver lining, to the extent you can say that there is one, is after this episode, governments all over the world will most likely give better funding to the various organizations that can help us trace and combat these types of things better.
If we were to keep this uncertainty for a moment, because I framed it that the problem was people are getting sick, people are dying, you hit back and you said, well, the real issue perhaps is uncertainty. How could we imagine where people have this deep desire, this real kind of instinctive pull, my gosh, I don't want to die right now. But the real issue is, okay, nobody wants to die and there's things killing us all the time. So there's uncertainty there. So I'm trying to use this as an exercise to get people to see how you are framing things, because I'm holding this fine book in my hands. What's your problem? And clearly we've got a nice big problem here, a nice juicy problem.
Yeah. First of all, you have to be careful about using the words the real problem, because in many cases there isn't just one core root problem. The reality is that most of the problems in our lives, from coronaviruses to business issues to stuff that's going on inside a family for that matter, they can be seen in multiple ways. So it's not that my framing around uncertainty is in any way more correct than your point that no, the issue is here that people are dying. If you have an elderly family member who's struck by this, that is your concern. That's a very, very real problem and people are dying. I'd say that the way to try to think about problems when we go into this, when you look at my work within problem framing as I described, is really to go in, as we're doing right now, and saying, first of all, what is the problem? Just getting a quick description of the problem on the table. And then you start thinking through these various lenses. This is the part what's called reframing, around trying to get different perspectives on it. And we've done that in one part, going in and saying, well, is this really about the disease as such, or is this about the effects that the disease is having on our society? That's an example of what you might call looking outside the frame. Looking outside the frame is this basic idea that when we have a problem in front of us, we tend to delve into the details. We say, oh, the problem is the disease. How do we understand the disease? How do we try to cure it? How do we prevent other people from getting it, and so on? Where sometimes you need to actually step away from the disease and look to other factors, or looking beyond the immediate problem you just defined.
You've got the big picture point here that you make early in your work. Is it about solving the problem or solving the right problem? The way you phrase that, when I look at myself, you realize, gosh, I spend a lot of time solving problems, but they're kind of like low-level bureaucracy maintenance problems where it's not really high impactful solving of high impact problems. Let me give you the opportunity to give your classic example with the elevator so people can wrap their arms around the elevator story, the slow elevator. If we need to bring it back to Corona later, we can, but I think the elevator story is a great classic way to bring people into your thinking.
In brief, this is the core example that I use to explain people what it's really about. And you imagine that you are the owner of an office building and that your tenants are complaining about the speed of the elevator. It's gotten so bad now that they are threatening to break the lease if you don't fix it. Normally, when people get a problem, again, they just immediately frame it, the elevator is slow, and then they jump into solution mode trying to fix that. How do we make the elevator faster? Do we upgrade the algorithm, put in a stronger motor? Do we have to go out and buy a new? If you ask building managers about this, because this is, of course, a real world problem, there's a solution they very often try, which has nothing to do with the speed of the elevator. Namely, they put up mirrors in the hallways. What happens there is that, of course, distracts everybody from the fact that they're waiting and tends often to reduce complaints. That example captures the idea of reframing, because what you're doing here is not trying immediately to jump in and solve the problem somebody just gave you. You try to step back and say, wait a second, is there a different and potentially better problem to solve? It might be the weight, it might be people's arrival times, it might be lots of other different factors you can go into. But the central idea here is, if you're not aware of the power of framing, you tend to get trapped in a specific solution space, in this case, asking, why is the elevator slow, and trying to fix that, instead of saying, is there a different way of looking at this? Is the speed of the elevator even the thing we should be focusing on, or is this more about the relationship to the tenants, the difficulty of attracting new tenants, or whatever it is? That's the core of the idea.
Here's an example I can bring right off the top of my head listening to you explain that one. If we were to think about something like cars, there are probably multiple car manufacturers out there that perhaps don't have the engineering of Ferrari. But if they give people an interior that has all of the luxury and creature comforts of home, you really might not care if you can get 0 to 60 in 2.1 seconds. You might just be very content that you are in this very quiet car. Your line of thinking really starts to unfold in a lot of different areas.
Absolutely. And you see this it's often a component in many of the innovation stories you see. Another example might be video games, where pre-Nintendo, most of the video game makers were focused on ever higher quality, like in the sense of, can we squeeze more pixels in there? And Nintendo went in and said, no, this is actually not necessarily about the resolution of the game. Equally important is the gameplay experience and other ways of playing video games. In most of the innovation stories you see, especially when an underdog kind of comes in and wins, that is typically related to them starting to solve a different problem, or realizing that clients care about something else than everybody is focused on in the moment.
That's a great example. I want to come back to it in a second. I was thinking of another one today. I use a Macintosh laptop and Macintosh products and all that kind of stuff, Apple products. And I clicked on Microsoft Word and I thought to myself, my God, it's opening as slow as it did 20 years ago. Why is this damn program opening as slow as it has forever? The reason is it's massive bloatware and they just keep adding more features that no one really uses. And the reality is I want the thing to just open quick, and it doesn't. Unlike the elevator story, there's nothing I can really do while I wait for it to open except want to throw my computer across the room.
That tends to be a bad idea. Yeah, I think this highlights something interesting about when you're looking at solving the right problems in the context of innovation and so on. The problem you come in and solve, it actually has to be fairly significant, in the sense that most of the entrenched operators, they benefit from being the incumbent. Nobody goes out and switches to a different computer after only one bad experience. We tolerate small inconveniences. One of my favorite examples is very, very different, a non-technological space, but from the history of when we invented the rolling suitcase. When you look at the history of suitcases, effectively, we put wheels on suitcases in the year 1972. Or in other words, in the span of human history, first we put a man on the moon, and then we put wheels on suitcases. That's an example of a super low-tech innovation that people just in the suitcase industry, they hadn't really realized that a lot of people struggled with lifting heavy suitcases. By going in and seeing a pain point like that, I mean, now it's very difficult to find a suitcase without wheels. Some of these things are really about not necessarily technology or bloatware or whatever, but also about seeing a problem that's been around for so long that we've almost become blind to it.
Now, what's interesting about your wheels on suitcases, how many people have a carry-on pull piece of luggage with wheels that you have to tilt? I still have some that you have to tilt versus the new ones that stand upright and they just roll, and the difference is dramatic.
It's so insane because you look at this space. I, for some reason, took an interest in the suitcase kind of history after seeing this. The initial invention of a suitcase in 1972, that's not even the suitcases we know today. It was literally just a square leather thing with 4 squeaky metal wheels and a leash you dragged it in. It was basically unstable, like walking with a drunken dog. It took 15 years before somebody came up with a tilting one, what's called the rollerboard. 15 years later, there's a pilot saying, wait a minute, there's got to be a smarter way of doing these suitcases. He quits his job as a pilot, builds a company around the roller board and lives off that the rest of his life. It's just so powerful to me that there's so often we don't see problems like that. And when we do, we can go in and build a career or a business around it. And as you point out, even later, somebody said, wait a minute, why do we have to tilt it when we can just drag it? It's amazing.
Let me take you back to Nintendo. And I'm thinking of Mario Brothers, which I used to be a proud player of. And I will still actually check out on YouTube every now and again some of these crazy Gen X and older guys that have become complete video game nerds that still just want to go through and play all the older stuff. Explain, if you know, Nintendo, I guess in the 80s, they only have, this is a little bit after Atari 2600, which was really crude in terms of graphics, but Nintendo had a few steps up. But I guess they realized, okay, we've got limitations right now, between, let's say, 1985 to 1990. There's limitations on the hardware. They can only get things moved along so far. So they really came at this from the standpoint of, let's don't worry about the graphics as much. Let's make the gameplay really, really awesome. And then that's a way to solve our problem.
I think the Nintendo has always had an ability to create interesting games. You mentioned Mario Brothers. I'm a Zelda man myself. I have spent countless hours running around the fictional country of Hyrule and trying to chop little monsters to pieces. I don't know the exact story of how Nintendo had that shift, but I do think what you're saying is the idea of limitations played into it. There are people who they look at the frame or the problem they've been given, and then they try to maximize within that. What made Nintendo different is they stepped away. This is another technique I often use, and trying to rethink the goal of what we're doing here. Clearly, there was an aim to try to increase the quality as much as possible. You can kind of see the conversations in the engineering labs. How do we make the frame rate a little bit faster? Nintendo went in and said, how do we change the game playing experience? How do we make this a different type of experience overall? I've seen an interesting incarnation of that in one of the companies I've studied, namely Samsung. They're also heavily into electronics and so on. They created small units around the world that had one job, namely to understand customer preferences better. To go in, they didn't look at technology at all. They went in and said, what's going on in our consumers' lives? What are the pain points like the rolling suitcase that we've been missing? And is there something there we can start coming up with products around? That was just a very successful strategy for them, literally just paying deliberate, focused attention to this question of what are the issues or the problems that our consumers or potential non-consumers are struggling with that we can do something about.
The work that you've put together, I guess some people might try to slot it as niche. It's not niche. It's something that every person involved in business needs to understand. But I could see how people might slot it that way. How did you find your way into approaching problems in a new way? I mean, how did this detailed work start to come together in your own mind?
It started really with my first book, which I published now 7 years ago, called Innovation as Usual, also with Harvard Business Press. And through that, I had worked with a lot of companies around innovation. And there was this thing about solving the right problem and reframing. Now, initially, I actually didn't really think it was that important because I figured, no, wait, solving the right problem, reframing, that's something we've known about for decades. I mean, ever since the time of Einstein, we've been aware of it. The first empirical evidence came up in the 70s. I kind of assumed this was a solved problem. Only the more I worked with clients in different companies, the more I realized that this was something most of them did not master. I had like a little bit of an epiphany. I ran this big program for a Fortune 500 company where we had the top talent of the business in the room. Literally, you had to be in the top 2% of your peer group to be there. After a week of lots of content, they came back and said, when we surveyed them at the end, reframing was the most valuable tool we received. That blew my mind in the sense that worried me. How come really, really smart people, top 2 talent in a Fortune 500 company, don't know how to solve the right problems? How can that be true? The more I looked at it, the more I just realized that's the case generally. I did a survey where 85% of the respondents, I asked 100 C-suite characters about it, 85% of the respondents came back and said, we actually struggle with this issue. We're not very good at it. My mission from that became to democratize the ability to solve the right problems. We've mastered this for a long time in niche environments, as you say. If you talk to somebody who's been trained in Six Sigma, they kind of have a sense of what this is. But most other people don't, and most of us don't have the time or the resources to go through a massive Six Sigma training or anything like that. So that's really the driving idea. The reason I came up to this, I just realized we need to make people better at this one core skill everywhere, in politics, in business, in personal life, wherever we have problems, which again is everywhere.
Why is this something that's buried? Like, why is this? I mean, I wasted my time in an MBA program. That says about it all right there. But why is this not something that, why do we get so caught up in the quote fundamentals, but then the very practical ways that one has to navigate to find impactful innovation to really boost that bottom line? We kind of like leave these topic areas, like you've gone down the path, we leave those out. It just strikes me as really unusual.
It was to me an example of a suitcase thing we just spoke about. I just realized we had this big missing gap in our collective toolboxes. And I realized that there's an opportunity to try to do something about it. Now, why is that the case? I think part of it is that we've been leaning into this myth that problem diagnosis is about taking the time to really think carefully about the problem. And this is where what I consider one of the most dangerous quotes in problem solving comes up, namely this thing which we say is attributed to Einstein. He never actually said it. This thing about, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend the first 55 minutes understanding the problem and the last 5 minutes solving. Now, that's something that people react very positively to when you say it. And in a sense, there's a true part in that, which is pay attention to the problem. But there's also a very dangerous part in it, which is the idea that good problem solving is about staying in analysis mode for the first 55 minutes of an hour. No, the vast majority of the problems in our lives, we don't have a week to take out of our schedule and go to a mountaintop and sit and philosophize around it. No, you have to develop the ability to do this quickly, to go in almost treating it as a habit of mind, or the ability having a 5-minute conversation around a problem where you try to see it from different lenses. I think that's been one of the things holding us back. Whenever we've struggled with solving the right problems, people have just responded like, oh, you have to take the time to really think deeply about it. That's not the right answer.
I can think back to putting up a first website, mid-1990s. My gosh, almost 25 years ago. I had no training in coding or anything like that, but it was kind of like learn on the job. You do what you think you should do. But what I kept doing was I kept putting something out there and I would get feedback. I didn't really have an idea that I thought I knew what I was doing. I would code a piece of HTML, code the look and feel the way that I thought it should be. I would take action. Then I would get feedback and I would see what would happen. I kept doing this iterative process of back and forth, versus sitting down, which, my gosh, I could kill myself for how many web developers have wasted my time with their great vision that they go off and disappear for 4 months and come back and say, oh, look at this wonderful thing I dreamed up. And we never were able to take it out into the field, so to speak. And then I can't tell you how many times it's been worthless because it's just been kind of what you described, a big thinking game, whereas they really weren't, quote, taking action.
Yeah. It to me it's indicative of one of the issues with how we approach problems at the moment. So if you look at the Lean Startup movement, I think they've done a phenomenal job of making people aware you have to reality test your hypothesis or your ideas pretty quickly. You don't just learn from analysis, you also learn from interfacing with the real world. This is where things get a little tricky, because one story I share in the book is that a guy called Maya Sin, who works at Nickelodeon, what he does, he has a problem. They've developed a great new app for kids. There's an issue with the sign-up flow because they know that kids love this app and they all want it. But when they try to get kids to sign up, for the first time sign up, there's a little bit of trickiness in that you have to find your Verizon password and put it in there. They can just see that almost none of the kids that start the process complete it. What do? Well, they resort to A/B testing. They go in and they test every imaginable permutation of the sign-up flow, the wording. How about 12-year-olds in the Midwest? How do they handle that? And after hundreds of tests, they're just nowhere. They can't move the rate at all. Until Maya goes in and says, wait, we're assuming here that this is a problem with usability. And we just have to trial and error and brute force our way forward. What if that's not the case? And what he does proves pivotal. He invites a couple of kids with their parents in tow into the workplace, and they sit down next to the kids. They just talk to them as they try to sign up. And what do they realize? It's nothing to do with usability. Most 10-year-olds can kind of crack a safe in 5 minutes flat. The problem was around fear. The kids, if you're a 10-year-old kid, you run into something that requires a family password, that's a sign that you're on a site you shouldn't be on. They were afraid to do anything. The solution for them was simply to add a video saying, hey kids, it's totally okay to ask your parents about this password. Here's what you should say to them. And immediately their sign-up rate just increases tenfold. A very beautiful example for me of the danger of just thinking, oh, we can just stay in trial and error mode and test stuff in the world. That's not a good idea if you're testing the wrong thing. You have to mix trial and error and lean startup way of thinking with this ability to step back and say, wait, are we solving the right problem here? Is there a different way to look at the problem itself?
You said Verizon, right?
Yes.
There's another part of that particular problem. The Verizon sign up is ridiculously poor. I mean, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. All these apps are tied to it because of the cable TV accounts and all that kind of nonsense. It's horrendous.
Yeah, it's beautiful because in this case, that was just a constraint they had to work with. Now, there's another level, of course, where you want to go in and hopefully help Verizon fix that. But very often, you're just working with constraints created by others, and you have to find a way of dealing with that. We can't change all of the world at the same time, so sometimes we have to find creative solutions within the bounds that we're given.
Yeah. Let me throw one at you, too, just a big picture issue. And you can bring up the example as well. There's a guy named Thomas Chamberlain that you speak about in your work, a geologist, but he's essentially getting at the confirmation bias issue that we all face. Why don't I let you run with that and let you outline that for my audience?
He was really one of the first modern thinkers to put his finger on what we're doing wrong with problem solving. He works back in the 1890s, so he's a contemporary of Darwin and then Marie Curie and lots of folks. And basically, at this time, there's become, in the scientific community, there's an awareness that you have to treat your theories a bit gingerly in the beginning. You can't just assume that you understand the world and kind of twist the facts to fit to it. That's what's called typically confirmation bias, that you only look for the evidence that is confirming your existing beliefs. Now, the scientific community at the time went in and said, well, we have to have this idea of what's called a working hypothesis. And that was really the notion that whenever you had a theory, you had to be a little bit cautious about it and say, well, let's just test whether this is true. That sounds very sensible on the surface. Hold your ideas lightly. What Chamberlain noticed was human nature doesn't work that way. He had theories to the love we have for our children. You can't really let go of the love you feel for your own pet. The antidote he came up with, and which has since been a principle in scientific investigation, is that notion is called multiple working hypothesis. At the outset, the second you run into some kind of phenomenon or problem you want to explain or understand, you have to try to come up with multiple different explanations right from the get-go. That is how you inundate yourself against falling in love with one particular theory. Like if you have an only child, you're going to love that child no matter what. But if you have a couple of different children at the same time, you can see them in a more nuanced way and you can compare and contrast between them. This very fundamental idea, whenever you run into something in the world, a problem or phenomenon you want to explain, try to come up with multiple different ways of looking at it before you go too far in the process.
So let's take it back to our elevator example. The initial thought would be, gosh, people are complaining, let's make the elevator fast. Well, that's not really the issue. That's not the wise issue. We could spend all the time to make the elevator fast. People will want faster. So they come up with the mirrors. But what could have been other ways? I guess at that moment in time, you would have been looking for not just mirrors. There could have been other things that would have made it to the discussion that eventually got deep sixed and didn't make it. But that's kind of the thinking there, right?
Exactly. And importantly, with the mirror example, it's not as if the mirror is the answer to the slow elevator problem. It's just an example of the idea that sometimes you can find better ways forward. But the mirrors, for instance, they wouldn't work if the core issue with the tenants is that they are late for something important, then mirrors are not going to help. If you go through that process, and I do this as part of my workshops, you literally just ask people for a couple of minutes to try to come up with alternative viewpoints on what might be going on. So another one might be, oh, this is a peak demand time. It's because everybody arrives, they want to go to lunch at 12 o'clock. That's where the problem is. And then you can say, well, in that case, maybe we can stagger the lunch breaks. Or you can go in and get more creative around the problem and say, well, is this really about the relationship overall? That I'm sure you've seen this in your private life on occasion, that people fight over things that are really just a symptom of something completely different going on. Is this because we've just gotten a new landlord that everybody hates? And now people have had enough and they just start complaining about something that they didn't do it before because they were okay, but now that they feel they're being treated badly, this starts coming up to the surface. Or you can spin it completely differently and say, this is a negotiation tactic. They're trying to lower the rent. Or even here, this is an issue with our contracts. How come we allow people to break the lease this easily? There's just a ton of different ways to go in and look at this, even a simple problem as the elevator problem. By getting into the habit of doing this just even for 5 minutes whenever you have a problem, you will end up finding better solutions. You'll make better decisions around the problems you face.
But back to the confirmation bias part of it, I think it really truly is got to be one of the biggest obstacles is that sense of pride, that sense of, I solved this in my own mind. I figured it out. And the reality is until you test it, you often don't know.
That's where one of the crucial things comes in around not trying to do this alone. Again, exactly as you say, we have a hard time letting go of our pet theories and so on. One of the core things I teach people is when you have a problem, try immediately to find one or two other people to discuss this problem with. And ideally, those people should know what reframing is as well, so they understand what you're trying to do. By pulling in other people, there's something magical happens. You just get a very powerful shortcut to seeing perspectives on the problem that you hadn't noticed, especially if those people, of course, are a little bit different from you. There's an issue of often being too close to our own problems, which you can't mitigate by talking to somebody who's very similar to you. You actually benefit from having people help you think about the problem if they're different from you, work in a different industry, have a different background, whatever it is. Diversity in this context can be very, very powerful.
I can't help but notice, as the author of 5 books, to look at your book that I'm holding in my hands, the layout of this book, the way this is structured is different than a typical book. Now, was this only the result of you sitting down with a great idea that you wanted to execute, or was it a result of many other people giving feedback? And I mean, what was the overall process? I mean, this style of thinking of how you put this book together, it's very different.
It's both. There was a founding idea behind it, which I'll share in a second. But the process and what really shaped this ultimately was feedback. When I wrote my first book, I did that in this isolation. We had to do a really big rewrite on it because I'd gotten a lot of things wrong when we finally got feedback on it. So with this book, at every stage in the process, I just tested both the tool itself and the chapters and the flow and everything with a ton of people. So you'll see in the acknowledgements, there's quite a long thank you list of all the poor people that got sucked into my book production process. That was one part of it. The other part, this, as you say, is kind of a broad format thing. There are sketches inside of it. The other part was really about this central idea of trying to democratize reframing. Because I felt if you're trying to create...
Explain that, the democratization of reframing, yes.
Well, it's just been locked up in various disciplines so far, like engineering, you can kind of learn about it. If you take a design thinking course, they've done a great job, by the way, of trying to popularize it. I mean, you get elements of this, but there just hasn't been a widely accessible tool that's not anchored to a specific industry or profession about this. The comparison here is getting to yes for negotiation. Before getting to yes was published, negotiation was seen as a niche skill by expert practitioners. What the authors of Getting to Yes did was really to make it clear that no, everybody negotiates all the time. And here is a guide to make you better at it. Part of that went into the layout. There's, especially around, as you can see in the book, the illustrations are actually crudely hand-drawn. They're drawn by me, by the way. And that was deliberate. I did not want to come in and do a shock and awe, super snazzy bells and whistles type design, because that to me is alienating. I wanted to do something that people felt they read it and they felt, hey, I could draw this for my team. And I realized as well that the more visual, kind of very simple illustrations you have of this, the better people remember it. On every page of the book, almost, there's some kind of sketched out illustration of the ideas I'm talking about. I have to give Harvard a lot of credit here, because I'll admit I thought they wouldn't be up for that in the beginning. They were very enthusiastic about it. They were immediately game for trying something new, which I think I benefited a lot from.
One thing that struck me, one particular part that struck me, were the 3 types of problems that you outlined. I guess it's the ill-defined mess or a pain point. That's number 1. Number 2, a goal we don't know how to reach. Number 3, a solution someone fell in love with.
Yeah, this comes back to the very first step in the reframing process, which is just like get a quick statement of the problem. And that sounds evident at first, but when you start working with real world problems, you very often realize that they're disguised as something else. A quick overview of that typology I kind of share. There are pain points. A pain point is just an immediate kind of thing that happens, and then we react to it. Our new product isn't selling. Then people jump into solutions and say, well, we need to invest more in marketing. There's just this thing that's creating pain of some kind in our life. And instead of trying to understand that or think about it, people just react. And they grab the nearest hammer that they have in their hand and they try to solve it. One thing, like just a mess you're facing and jumping into solutions. A goal is another way that problems often arise. Somebody comes to us and says, hey, we only have revenue of $15 million and we need to get to $18 million next year. Now that's, in one way you could say, yeah, that's a problem. But actually, that's just a goal statement. That's just somewhere we want to go. And for that process to work, we have to step back and say, wait, we actually have to find problems that other people care about to solve so we can create that value. We're not just going to get there by magically throwing a higher number out there and saying, we're going to get there.
The issue there, too, though, is where does the goal even come from?
Oh, yeah, that's often quite random. I mean, you've seen this used as a motivational technique by many leaders. They go in and set a higher goal, like a stretch goal or a big, hairy goal, as I think Jim Collins kind of called it back then. I mean, the research into this shows that that actually kind of works. If you set a stretch goal, people try harder. They get a little bit nudged out of their usual way of doing things because they have to find ways of reaching it. The problem arises when it's set without context. If you set a stretch goal where people don't feel they have the tools to potentially get there or the support, then it's highly demotivating. And you can have anybody you talk to who've had a boss who didn't get that, they will tell you stories of incredible frustration about clueless leaders that say, yeah, we'll go back this weekend, come up with an industry kind of changing idea and have it ready for Monday with no money. You see that pattern, unfortunately. The third type of problem you see, and that's in some ways the worst one, that's when people have already fallen in love with the solution and they want you to deliver it without them necessarily understanding what the problem is. Everybody who's worked with clients know that feeling of somebody coming and saying, you know what, I need a big green button on my website. Often the worst thing you can do is to go in and give them what they want. You have to go in and say, wait, what is the problem you're trying to solve for? What is the goal we're trying to reach? Often that conversation will lead you to realize, no, you don't actually need a big green button. You need something completely different that you need to take the client through.
I can't see anything controversial in the concept of frame, reframe, move forward. It seems intuitive when someone smacks me on the head and says, Mike, consider this. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Are there people out there, though? Are there organizations out there that you've encountered where they have, in your mind, given you legitimate skepticism, legitimate criticism over this reframe, move forward?
I don't think I've ever encountered it on an intellectual level. People, once they understand what this is, and once they understand the reasoning for it, everybody kind of agrees like, oh yeah, this isn't necessary. The resistance typically comes when you're suddenly dealing with a real world problem where people have to be shifted back into that problem space and say, wait, there's something different here we need to think about instead of just charging ahead with our standard solution. And I think that's one of the interesting things we spoke about the framework and how it arose before. One of the things we've missed in this framework with this tool is really the importance of practicing it. Because you can explain this concept to somebody in a minute, use the slow elevator example or whatever you like, but you want to make it work until people have actually started practicing this and almost build the mental muscle for how to reframe problems. And so you'll see in the book as well, I have a lot of examples that people can kind of try their hand at, brain teasers, stuff like that, just to start building the muscle of reframing. So getting it as a skill and ideally getting some of your team members on board with it. So this can be difficult to do if you're the only person who's kind of like understands why it's necessary to talk a bit more about the problem. The second you have even just one or two people in the room with you who also understand what you're doing, that conversation becomes a lot easier.
You open up Pandora's box when you talk about practice. When you talk about practice, that's an entirely different conversation in the sense that we could go on for hours about, look, if somebody picks up your book, they pick up my book, whoever's book, and they might think, well, that's cool, da-da-da-da-da. But people don't realize that in any kind of work like this or any kind of innovation, people don't think about, there's a certain pathology that one has to have to make sure that your book looks like it looks like. I mean, you got to be slightly crazy and slightly OCD to make sure that the final product is perfect.
I'm quite flattered that you called me mildly crazy. I take that's a compliment. I guess every time you're trying to do something new, it helps having a vision of what you're trying to do. What helped me tremendously in this process, I think, was both to have collaborators with Harvard who understand what I try to do. And most of all, again, testing. Harvard is one of the few publishers. They have a blind peer review where the book goes out to 5 experts and they try to tear it apart. That was incredibly valuable in relation to that because the peer reviewers, they found some mistakes that I need to fix, but they came back as well and said, hey, this design, this layout, this thing with the sketches, that really works. I think that's where we sometimes go wrong when we talk about the craziness or the idiosyncratic vision of a Steve Jobs wannabe. I mean, often that vision is wrong. We see the success stories come out of the other end when somebody has come up with a really novel product. We don't really hear the stories of all the people that thought they're visionary, but they're just wrong. What to me helps in that process is the idea of early and constant testing of your vision and trying to see if it's actually true.
This color red on your front cover.
Yeah.
There's some backstory. I know there has to be.
There is. This came back to a big discussion we had around the title. I mean, the title, What's Your Problem? And it's kind of in glaring red. It's a little provocative. We had a big discussion around, was this title too confrontational and was this layout? Red is not a color you associate with happiness and should be,
It's associated with blood.
Yeah, and exactly. And it came back to this question of what we were trying to solve for. Because in a sense, if you're a risk-averse publisher, and all publishers are, for good reasons, because most books don't do that well, you kind of try to mitigate all small potential things, and you try to go the safest route possible. That's normally a good idea. The problem that I thought we needed to solve for, first of all, was just to make people take notice. How many books don't you walk past on a daily basis in bookstores, in airports, and wherever you see books on Amazon, where you never take a second look at the thing? In my view, the core problem we first of all had to solve for was to make people stop, take notice, and maybe pick up the book or click on it on Amazon or whatever book provider people use. Once we had that problem solved, then we could consider how do people react to it beyond that point.
Yeah, I could just realize looking at your cover and having every one of my past cover debates with 3 different publishers roll through my head. I'm happy that at least one author got to do something that they enjoyed on their cover versus being told that the in-house design staff, that the ego might be hurt if we didn't go along with their really crappy design. The book, What's Your Problem to Solve Your Toughest Problems? Change the problems you solve. Thomas, is there a website we can direct people to? They can buy the book at Amazon, all that fun stuff, but is there a website you want to direct people to?
they can go to howtoreframe.com. That has information both on the book and the various tools I kind of offer and some of the free stuff that's in the book as well. And I kind of want to add another perspective on that discussion you just raised around getting people to accept a risk, because the way we eventually positioned it was to say there is a slightly higher risk by going in with the provocative angle. You might actually see a slightly lower sales from that, but it also has a potentially much, much higher upside compared to a middle of the road book. That was the argument that ultimately convinced us that it was right to go with the provocative option, framing it not as a risk issue, but as a potential, here's how we might get lucky and go in and create a bestseller on the level of getting to yes.
There's a great Japanese bookstore in one of the Singapore malls, and I was in there about 6 months ago, and I noticed they had the top 10 nonfiction business books selling. I think like 4 of them had the F-bomb on the cover. Clearly, people had they kind of looked around and said, oh, let's get out there. Let's get that provocative really out there. You could have said, what's your effing problem? Then Harvard would have said, well, maybe you should self-publish that one.
Yeah, I think that would have been a bridge too far. Let's see with the sequel.
Yeah. Hey, listen, Thomas, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for educating me and my audience.
It was such a pleasure. I love your podcast, so very happy to have been part of it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.